Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Sophie Turenne. I co-direct CELS, the Center of European Legal Studies, with Professor Albertina Albert-Lawrence, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you to this evening's Mackenzie-Stuart Lecture. It is my pleasure, most of all, to welcome our speaker, Minister Nick Thomas Symonds. There will be time for questions after the lecture, and Professor Emeritus John Bell, former director of our center, will chair that session. If you don't manage to raise your question, to ask your question, you can try again later. We invite everyone to come along to the reception drinks afterwards in the atrium. Tonight's lecture is the 26th lecture to be given in honor of Lord Mackenzie-Stuart. As many of you know, Lord Mackenzie-Stuart was an alumnus of Cambridge University. He became the first British judge of the European Court of Justice in 1973 and went on to serve as president of the court between 1984 to 1988. This lecture series was founded in 1997 to honor his contribution and celebrate the many connections between this university, the European Union, and the Council of Europe. We have been blessed with illustrious speakers, including members of the Court of Justice, the EU Commission, the European Court of Human Rights, and members of the UK government and Parliament. Our speaker tonight, Minister Nick Thomas Symonds, grew up in and currently represents the Welsh constituency Torfaen. He read politics, philosophy, and economics at Oxford, but we shall not hold that against him. He was elected a Fellow of the Royal Historical Society in 2012, and his most recent book on Harold Wilson was published in 2022. He also practiced at the bar at Civitas Law in Cardiff, Wales' first specialist civil and public law chambers. Then came his current political career. On entering Parliament in 2015, he was shortly made Shadow Minister for Work and Pensions. Then in 2016, he was made Shadow Solicitor General, and in 2017, Shadow Minister for Security. In 2020, he became Shadow Home Secretary, and in 2021, Shadow Secretary of State for International Trade, before being made Shadow Minister without portfolio in the Cabinet Office in 2023. Ladies and gentlemen, the good news is that now he's out of the shadows altogether. Since Labour came to power, Nick Thomas Symonds is now Paymaster General and Minister for the Cabinet Office, Minister for the Constitution and European Relations. I now ask him to deliver his talk, and thank you very much for being here.
Well, thank you very much for that very kind introduction. And it's a great pleasure and indeed an honour to be invited to deliver this lecture today. Firstly, this is a very prestigious series of lectures, and it is wonderful to follow in the footsteps of so many esteemed figures who've offered deep reflections on the issue of UK-EU relations. In a debate that frankly has all too often been defined by heat, this lecture series is an opportunity to shed more light. And that's why assembling an array of people with deep experience in this field over decades is so valuable. Perhaps it does turn out that not everybody has had enough of experts. But even before Brexit, it was obvious that the relationship between the UK and Europe has never been static. Just a look at the breadth of subjects and arguments that have been covered over the lifetime of this lecture series shows how dynamic an issue it has always been. This debate has complexity and it has vibrancy. Now, as has already been mentioned, I did spend many years as a lecturer myself at Oxford University. And during that time, I taught British politics, American politics, and indeed European politics. By the way, I can see no clearer sign of the commitment of this UK government to strengthening the Oxford-Cambridge corridor than asking this proud St Edmund Hall alumnus to put aside varsity rivalries and attend today's event, though perhaps don't ever ask me to change allegiances during the boat race. But in all seriousness, I loved my time lecturing at Oxford. So much so that I used to commute each week from my home in Torvine. And those two cornerstones of my own identity are a theme I will return to later. Now, I was also a barrister. I have to admit, and I tread very carefully here, given there's a sign behind me that says Centre for European Legal Studies, EU law was not always the first area that ambitious young lawyers gravitated towards, though I have to say, a very special few most definitely did. One later told me that they found the Byzantine nature of the subject matter sometimes off-putting, and it was a discussion I always remember taking place when we were talking about incidental horizontal direct effect. But it was, and still is, such an important grounding for those interested in the EU and how it interacts with the UK. And today I reflect upon my own admiration for Oxford and Cambridge, and I'm deeply proud of the time that I spent teaching so many excellent students. I have to say that a worrying number of them now pop up in the civil service, including in my own department. Time and tide wait for no man, I guess. And when the Prime Minister asked me to take on the work of leading the reset with the European Union, I was of course honoured, but I also felt well grounded for the task. Importantly, I'd worked at the sharp end of politics. I served on the front bench, as you've heard, through the years of the Brexit debate. I'd even gone toe-to-toe with the then Attorney General, Geoffrey Cox, across the dispatch box, and from time to time, it was in the most heated of moments. The sketch writers, of course, had a field day with it. But from my time in those roles, it was clear that the country did not want to be dragged back to a past that resulted in such division, acrimony, and distraction. Alongside my experience of the debate in Westminster, I also represent a constituency, my home constituency, that voted to leave by 60%. It's where I commuted from as a young lecturer in Oxford, and I am very proud to be a truly local member of Parliament. And I know that in the referendum in 2016, people I represent, they voted for a change to the status quo and to be listened to. And that is why, in the 2024 manifesto, we did set out that with Labour, Britain will stay outside the EU, and we were clear about our red lines: no return to the single market, customs union, or freedom of movement. Now, of course, I know that some people do not agree with these. In a debate that's run as deep as this, I wouldn't expect anything else. But today, I want to look forward to the future relationship between the United Kingdom and the European Union. I'm going to argue that the historic context of the relationship is vital. And I want to highlight the importance of the UK and the EU building a strategic alliance and what its priorities could be. Before I turn, though, to the main body of my remarks, I think it's appropriate to acknowledge the life and work of the man this lecture series is named after. The first person from the UK to become a judge at the European Court of Justice, and the first and only British president of the court, John Mackenzie-Stuart was an indomitable force on the European scene. And evident from his engagement throughout his career, he believed the United Kingdom had a vital role to play in the continent-wide conversation. It's a sensibility that continues in this university, in all those who study here, and all former lecturers who've stood where I am today. And as a historian and politician, when considering the future of the relationship between the UK and the EU, as with any major political issue, I think it's instructive to look to the lessons of the past. Unsurprisingly, those thoughts and feelings have often shifted with the context that those minds found themselves in. My own party's past, the Labour past, has had a complex history when it comes to Europe. When Ernest Bevin thought of Europe as the wartime Minister for Labour and National Service, and then as the post-war Foreign Secretary, he probably thought that his constituency of Wandsworth which saw over 700 bombs dropped on it, had a great deal in common with the rubble remaining of so many other neighbourhoods on the continent. It might have been this belief that became a foundation for his Western Union speech in the beginning of 1948. In the House of Commons, he spoke with great fervour. He said this: how much these countries have in common. Our sacrifices in the war, our hatred of injustice and oppression, our parliamentary democracy, our striving for economic rights, and our conception and love of liberty are common among us all. Our British approach is based on principles which also appeal deeply to the overwhelming mass of the peoples of Western Europe. I believe the time is ripe, he says, for a consolidation of Western Europe. Yet the Prime Minister he served under, Clement Attlee, was a lot more cautious. And indeed, in his remarks to the House of Lords in 1962, by then, of course, a former Prime Minister for some years, he actually was unequivocal on the UK membership to the common market. And he said this: I must confess that I have been one of those against, particularly from the long-term political view, because I am quite sure that it is impossible for us to enter into these economic arrangements without being pulled sooner or later into a political association, which I do not think is desirable. Now, Harold Wilson, too, had a more global mindset. He wanted to see an ambitious Europe, one which, in his words, plays in world affairs, the part which the Europe of today is not at present playing. And he admitted years later to the Labour Party conference in 1975, I have never been emotionally a Europe man. I have been and remain fundamentally a Commonwealth man. The fact is, the question of the UK's relationship with the EU has always been hotly debated within the Labour Party and the country at large. And of course, the EU referendum did fundamentally shift that debate. We have that definitive position for the UK outside the European Union. But also, in our manifesto, we set out that Britain is always stronger when we work with others, and that we will seek to deepen ties with our European friends, neighbours, and allies. And the intervening period has provided more stark clarity on the intense global challenges that have fallen to this generation of leaders to solve, and the need for allies to join together to address them in a new strategic alliance. And there is no more obvious example of this than the role our Prime Minister has been playing in recent weeks on Ukraine, working in partnership with European leaders from across our continent, including President Macron, Prime Minister Meloni, the leaders of NATO, the European Commission, and indeed the European Council. Coming together in London, committing Europe to doing the heavy lifting to support peace on our continent, and developing a coalition of the willing. Vital as this work is, and I will come on in more detail to the importance of coordinating defence across our continent, it is but just one example of the mutual interests, challenges, and opportunities that face both the UK and the EU at this time. And in the face of these generational moments, it is incumbent upon us to build that new strategic alliance to deliver the results our citizens demand. From the threat of war to the scourge of people smugglers, the need to seize the opportunities of the green transition and the desire for growth, the issues we are dealing with are closely intertwined. I'm remembered of Ernest Bevin's claim in 1948 that, and I quote, Britain cannot stand outside Europe and regard her problems as quite separate from those of her European neighbours. Many of the challenges that the UK Cabinet is grappling with are the same for governments across Europe. We need to react to the world that we find ourselves in right now to actually prepare for the future appropriately, an opinion shared by Bevin, who said, again in 1948, and I quote, we must face the facts as they are. to meet the situation which now confronts the world. And I believe that firm alliance between the UK and the EU is undeniably a part of that and is mutually beneficial. We need to put an end to ideology, reset our relationship with Europe. Of course, that doesn't mean that the EU and the UK will agree on all things. That's just the nature of all relationships. And for me, in my role, I intend to be a ruthlessly pragmatic negotiator. The government was elected on a mandate of national security, keeping our citizens safe and encouraging growth. And our relationship with Europe is a crucial part of every one of those priorities. Anyone who says otherwise, by the way, has either not engaged fully in the facts or, heaven forbid, is too busy playing politics. But some have suggested that given the fast-moving situation we find ourselves in, the UK must choose. Either it's a relationship with the US or a relationship with the EU. Now, I couldn't disagree with that more, as a good relationship with both is crucial to our future. As the Prime Minister said in his Lord Mayor's banquet speech in December, Attlee did not choose between allies, Churchill did not choose, the national interest demands we work with both. Now, when it comes to our friends across the continent, I am always clear with them that a more cooperative relationship with the EU is in our national interest. It means making the case for closer working with our allies in the EU to make people across the UK and the EU safer, more secure, and more prosperous. And it means that we are working to strengthen cooperation, moving away from a zero-sum win-lose dynamic that we've seen too much of in recent years. And that's the spirit that I take in the discussions that I'm having with the EU. We need to be respectful of the obligations we have in the existing agreements and frameworks. That is how trust is earned. That is how trust is sustained. I'm proud of the work done under the last Labour government to secure peace in Northern Ireland. It's why, when we were in opposition, we supported the Windsor Framework, and why I and my good friend and colleague, Hilary Benn, continue to work so closely on this agenda. I believe that where we can, we should build on the foundation these agreements provide to offer something more to our citizens and our society. We are facing a once-in-a-generation moment, one where the collective security of our country and the continent is being tested on a number of levels. Global instability is more the norm now than ever, and nowhere is this more obvious, more palpable than it is in Ukraine. To secure our continent, we must work together to ensure peace. As the Prime Minister said to the House of Commons in recent days, we have, as he put it, a recognition of the fact that once again we live in an era where peace in Europe depends upon strength and deterrence, but also a rediscovery of the old post-war argument that economic security is national security. In a world that is more focused on division, the idea of working together to overcome common issues has a raw power. Now, since this government took office, we've been driving forward a new phase of the relationship between the UK and the EU. In December, the Chancellor of the Exchequer attended a meeting of EU finance ministers. This was the first time a British Chancellor had been invited to the Eurogroup since Brexit. The Foreign Secretary and the EU High Representative for Foreign Affairs have also met, agreeing to work towards a security partnership. Throughout this new work, they have committed to 6 monthly foreign policy dialogues, starting early this year. This will support our wider reset ambitions to deliver that greater safety, security, and prosperity. We also have seen some great scientific and research work. I was particularly pleased to see our reaccession to Horizon, and indeed I've been lucky enough here earlier today to see some of this work at first hand. We should never, by the way, have left Horizon in the first place, but I'm pleased that we do now have that certainty back. When there is more pressure than ever on international economies to innovate and create new products and services through research, the return to this scientific collaboration is greatly appreciated. Now, for my part, I've been meeting regularly with my EU counterpart, Maroš Šefčovič, the Commissioner for Trade and Economic Security, making sure that there is oversight and forward momentum in the work that is going on. We will both be jointly addressing the Parliamentary Partnership Assembly made up of UK and EU politicians to explain this work and how they too can get involved for the benefit of Europe. Now, so far by my count since the election, we've seen over 70 direct engagements between UK ministers and EU counterparts. And this work was exemplified by the meeting the Prime Minister had with the President of the European Commission last October, a meeting where both agreed to put our relationship on a more solid, stable footing. They agreed to work together on some of the most pressing global challenges, including economic headwinds, geopolitical competition, irregular migration, climate change, and energy prices. This multilateral approach is wholly necessary, especially given the situation we find ourselves in. There are plenty of issues in the recent past that have become stymied by ideologically driven decisions, which have ended up with worse outcomes for both the UK and the EU. As Business Europe set out in a report last autumn, there remain many unnecessary barriers to trade and investment. Following the elections of new governments in the EU and UK, there is a clear opportunity to upgrade the relationship to deliver for businesses and citizens. I wholeheartedly agree with them. You only need to look at the figures to see how complicated things have become. The EU is the UK's biggest trading partner, with trade totalling in 2023 over £800 billion. But that trade has been falling. And we know there are too many barriers holding back businesses from sales and growth. I hear all too often businesses telling me that they have given up on exporting because of the bureaucratic hurdles they face. A study published last year by Aston Business School showed that between 2021 and 2023, the goods EU businesses export to the UK were down by 32%, while UK goods exports to the EU were down by 27%. Now, that outlook should be sobering. It is not good for British business or European businesses, especially at a time when both our economies need a kick start. We need to reduce trade barriers if we want to continue to have a healthy economic relationship with our largest trading partner. And that means strengthening cooperation, moving away from the divisive language of recent years, moving towards, as I say, a new strategic alliance and what it could mean for the UK and the EU. And to that end, I've been defining its structure. What guides this government is its plan for change. The cross-departmental missions that aim to fix some of the greatest challenges facing our society. From making our streets safer to making the UK a green energy superpower, from improving the NHS to breaking down barriers to opportunity, our plan for change does not focus on which department is responsible for what policy, but encourages cooperation across government and across society to tackle the troubles that persist. This cooperation extends to our international connections, especially if we want to create a strong foundation for the UK to thrive. The government was elected on a mandate to strengthen national security by reconnecting with our allies, to increase people's safety through strong borders and increase prosperity through growth. Our European allies have shared interests in all those priorities, and that is why these priorities form the three pillars of a reset in our relationship. A focus on national security, safe and secure borders, and economic prosperity. We must respond to the collective security challenge faced by our continent and advance this through a UK EU ambitious security and defence relationship. On safety, we must do all we can to strengthen our continental collective ability to tackle organised crime and criminality and working together on irregular migration. And on prosperity, we must boost growth and living standards. To do so, we need to build export and investment opportunities for UK businesses and at the same time reduce barriers to trade with our biggest trading partners. Safety, security, prosperity, they are the foundations of our plans. And let me now spend the remainder of this lecture explaining the opportunities that we can seize to be part of this new future for the UK and the EU. First, let me turn to security. Now, as I have been focusing on in this lecture, security should be the cornerstone of any international relationship, but certainly with Europe. We share many of the same challenges and our concerns are in concert with one another. The importance of a collective effort to rise to the scale of the security challenge our continent faces is very clear. As our Prime Minister has said, I have long argued that in the face of ongoing and generational challenges, European countries must do more for their own defence. That is incontrovertible, a completely reasonable point. It's a generational challenge, of course it is, one we must now take on. And it is a situation that I am sure would be as familiar to all of you here as it was to Ernest Bevin when he was speaking in 1948. Where the world was in the run-up to his Western Union speech has some remarkable similarities to today. Following the Marshall Plan of 1947, he was determined to show to the world that the Europeans had a plan, that they would unite, and that they would reduce the risk of another war. The Brussels Pact was created in March 1948 and signed by Belgium, France, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, and the United Kingdom. Through this, they were committed to come to one another's defence in the event of an attack, a principle which would be central to the future North Atlantic Treaty. It showed the US how strong an alliance could be. I am today reminded perhaps of the quote often attributed to Mark Twain, that history does not repeat itself, but it often rhymes. Now, a show of European strength is needed once again. And the UK has reiterated our readiness to negotiate a security and defence partnership with the EU, with absolute clarity that NATO is our cornerstone. And beyond that security and defence partnership agreement, we can see more opportunities for cooperation, focusing on key issues facing our continent's security. It was a message the Prime Minister shared during the informal European Leaders Retreat in Brussels in February. He proposed several important steps to increase defence cooperation. He suggested more focus on research and development, which built on the UK's unique skills as the home of NATO's Defence Innovation Accelerator and bringing the UK and EU's minds together via Horizon Europe. He suggested we could improve military mobility across Europe, which would be crucial to move troops and material to where they need to be more easily. There were opportunities, he explored, for greater cooperation to protect ourselves from state threats and sabotage of our critical national infrastructure, as well as cooperation on missions and operations like in the Red Sea, and of course the UK's efforts to train Ukrainian troops. Finally, he suggested a more industrial collaboration between the EU and the UK, making the point we already have, building on excellent existing partnerships which deliver jobs and growth at home, whilst bolstering our national security. Now let me move to the second pillar, on the safety of citizens. Now firstly, through this interconnectedness on defence, I believe that we can improve on the systems that keep our citizens safe. We see every day the threats our continent faces from criminals with no respect for international borders. From terrorism to vile people smuggling gangs and drug smugglers, the threat to our communities is very real. If we want to protect our respective borders and keep our citizens safe, then we need to work together. And I think of those people, shoved into boats during the night time, going on the most treacherous journeys organised by even more treacherous criminals who trade in people's lives. Cooperation across borders is the only way we're going to break up the vile global trade in human trafficking, which affects so many European countries. Now, we have made important progress on this work. The Prime Minister has stated that border security will be at the very heart of our plans to reset our relationship with the European Union. And just a few weeks ago, my colleague Yvette Cooper was in France to meet her counterpart, the Minister of the Interior, announcing joint measures to tackle the gangs. By the way, that was the first Home Secretary visit to northern France in 5 years. And that is exactly the kind of joint working we want to see more of. The Home Secretary has also announced a 50% uplift in National Crime Agency officers to be based inside Europol with immediate effect, alongside a commitment to deepen our partnership with Europol and its European Migrant Smuggling Centre. But I believe we can go further. Best ways to better coordinate law enforcement to really smash the gangs behind the small boats and other illegal activity. We must do all we can to strengthen the tools available to our collective ability to tackle organised crime. The third pillar I'd like to focus on is improving prosperity. Now, I want you to just think back to the beginning of this year. On the same day, the 29th of January, the UK Chancellor Rachel Reeves and the President of the European Commission gave speeches about growth in their respective economies. The Chancellor didn't shy away from the economic challenges that we are confronting. She said growth will not come without a fight, without a government willing to take the right decisions now to change our country's future for the better. But for too long, that potential has been held back. Now, some 250 miles away, President von der Leyen presented the European Commission's competitiveness compass, stating that, and I quote, "Europe has everything it needs to succeed, but at the same time we must fix our weaknesses to regain competitiveness." A major initiative to steer the Commission's work on growth, the competitiveness compass sets out the importance of trade openness, not only for sustaining Europe's prosperity, but also for enhancing its resilience. Low growth cannot be allowed to be the destiny for the UK or the European economy. Research and innovation, reducing red tape, creating a new skills agenda, boosting productivity, a more resilient economy. All these elements found in the EU's competitiveness compass are also crucial parts of the Prime Minister's plan for change. These are areas of mutual interest for both our economies, and it would make economic sense to work closely with our largest trading partner. Already, we have started work on this. We have said we will seek to negotiate a sanitary and phytosanitary agreement, one of the clear barriers to trade across the continent. We've also agreed to find new ways to resolve issues like the mutual recognition of professional qualifications. And we know too that businesses are fed up with the status quo. Alex Freudman, the managing director of M&S Food, went on record earlier this year saying, and I quote, "We wholeheartedly support the government's plan to negotiate a veterinary agreement. The benefits would be significant. There is no discernible downside. We will offer whatever help we can to aid the negotiations." It's clear to me that we need to work together with our European friends to overcome these restrictive conditions which our business leaders, the people who drive growth, are experiencing. An important part of this too is how we use energy. The existing trade and cooperation agreement does not contain effective means of cooperation on green technologies which are necessary for our decarbonisation objectives. We are also trading power under inefficient arrangements, which means higher energy costs. Indeed, the need for new electricity trading arrangements was acknowledged in the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, but there has been limited progress on developing a more efficient system since then. The need for improved arrangements is more pressing as we scale up interconnection and develop shared hybrid assets in the North Sea. We need to support rather than hinder the investment case for these projects. More broadly, enhancing cooperation on green technologies will support our shared commitments towards the environment, growth, and ensure we are maximising the enormous renewable potential of the region. All these aspects, security, safety and prosperity, will have the opportunity for a proper and considered discussion in our upcoming EU-UK summit on Monday, the 19th of May. And as we do approach that summit, it's an important moment. We have a chance to develop this new strategic alliance, to rise to the challenges and to seize the opportunities of the moment. In the UK, we must be ruthlessly pragmatic, open to the changes that occur around us, and act for the welfare of our citizens, our country, and the continent, and deliver in the national interest. It is true that the UK's relationship with Europe has taken many forms since the Second World War. And of course, that democratic decision in 2016 is a fundamental shift. That choice by the British public, we fully respect. That was clear in our manifesto. But we are demonstrating, through the implementation of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement and the Windsor Framework, our commitment to fulfil our international obligations. But this global moment requires us to go further. It's an opportunity to build our partnership where continental security is paramount, where our collective safety is guaranteed, and where our respective economies flourish together. Of course, reaching that agreement will take time, but it is a process that has already begun. And the UK government from the very top has made this a priority. We have seen a unity and decisive action with Europe that had been absent in the recent years of division. I'm reminded actually of the words of a former Cambridge student, one that many of you may recognise. No man is an island entire of itself. Every man is a piece of the continent, a part of the main. If a clod be washed away by the sea, Europe is the less. Now, in times of great challenge, and these are times of great challenge, we must build that UK-EU alliance anew to keep the United Kingdom safe, secure, and more prosperous. The road to that runs through Europe, not around it. Thank you very much.